Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, your book club discussion times 10. This is the second part of episode 3, my discussion with author Tracey Baptiste about her novel The Jumbies. Be sure to listen to part 1 first. Corinne is such an interesting character. There's tons to talk about her, but I think one of the things that I saw is that when she kind of picks trouble. You know, she kind of gets herself into trouble, and
that is true.
There was one situation where she went into the forest and encountered, and it's Duane?
Yes, the Duanes, yes.
Duane.
So she wanted to, I think in that moment she wasn't sure, she sort of wanted to verify what was going on and sort of test
with her own eyes.
And sort of test it out for herself, which was an incredibly sort of foolish, dangerous thing to do, but also the kind of thing that a kid would do.
Right.
Like a kid would be like, did that actually happen?
Right.
Let me go do that again. Let me see. Did I actually just burn my finger on that match? Let me try that again and see if that's really what happened. Yeah. You know, she's sort of
reproducibility.
Exactly. Yeah. She's trying to figure it out. And so she very foolishly goes into the forest and then, of course, is set upon by a band of Duanes immediately.
Yeah. I mean, kids do that a lot. I think adults do that a lot too.
Probably.
Right? I mean, I think we're generally, as people, we tend to put ourselves in these strange situations sometimes. And, you know, I was just curious if you had any thoughts as to why that was, either kids or adults. You know, like why do we end up in these situations that we probably beforehand know are not good ideas?
I think you're right. And I think we do a lot of the time know ahead of time that this is not going to be a good idea. And I think we do it anyway. And it might be because we are maybe seeking a little bit of the danger. We're sort of curious about what our ability is for getting out of a situation, or I don't know. It is odd, and I have done like some very unwise things in my life that I knew were not a good idea. Like I know going in that this is not a good idea, and you know I did it anyway, and I wish I had a good answer for even why. I feel like in some ways I was sort of courting danger and just to see, kind of to see, you know?
Yeah. Because it's one of those things where how would, you know, like, I forgot what, it's like a Mark Twain quote or something, but he's getting at like, we'll remember the stuff that we did. You know, in like 20 years, you'll remember the things you did, not the things you didn't, or something like that.
Right.
The idea that we're trying to create stories for ourselves.
It might be that.
You know?
I mean, I do think that there is something about that, to say that you have done something that is foolish and you live to see the day. You know, I think that is very much a motivation is to create a story for yourself. And because I mean, what are the stories that we tell each other? You know, we tell the stories about the dumb things we've done, and we're like, look, I'm still alive.
Ta-da. Yeah. That's basically what parties are for, I think, to share those stories specifically. So I thought the pacing of the book was really well done. And, you know, some books have a hard time with this. And I think the key here is balancing sort of world building and descriptions versus action. And especially as you got towards the end of the book, the action really picked up the pace. The chapters got shorter and shorter. Things were happening constantly, and it really reached a climactic conclusion. And I thought that was really, really well done. And I was just curious about how you got to that point. How did you decide to structure it that way? Why did you think that was the best way to go?
I had a lot of difficulty actually with the pacing. It's probably the pacing that took the longest, because I had a very good idea of the plot very early on. Like once I sort of glommed onto the idea that this was going to be a fairy tale, I had a very clear idea of the plot. And so then it was sort of figuring out Severine was the next part, and then figuring out the pacing was the next part. I decided to have the story be told from different perspectives starting early. So Severine gets her own chapter very early on. And so you see things from her perspective very early on. But for the most part, most of the book stays with Corinne almost throughout until we get to the end and to that big climactic ending where everybody has to play a part in either distracting or setting, things onto a clear path so that Corinne is able to execute her big plan to get rid of Severine. And so at that point, I felt that it would be easier and more fun for me and probably more exciting for the reader to just switch back and forth really quickly, sort of like a movie, so that you're seeing like these tiny scenes of somebody striking a match or somebody running out of a forest or somebody, like their boat breaks up or, whatever it is. And so it just all goes very quickly. And so it kind of forces the reader in a way to get through all of the end of it in one shot.
Yeah.
I was very purposefully trying to force the hand of the reader at that point to say, okay, you're sticking with this until the end. Like, here we go. This is it. Just and you don't realize because some of the chapters are literally like 2 or 3 lines.
Yeah, they're real short.
And some of them are a little bit longer, but some of them are like super. So you just kind of just keep turning and keep turning and keep turning. Like, what's next? Who's next? Like, what are they doing next? Like, how did this person get out of this? Like, and so it was huge fun for me to write in this way. And so I figure it would be huge fun for the reader to get through all of it this way too.
That's great. It's always good when everyone's having fun.
I know, yes.
Writer and reader. I talked earlier about this in the sense that the book is sort of a Native people's story, or at least one part of it is a Native people's story, and that, Severine and her people were there originally, and then the current inhabitants kind of came in and, overtook the island, and, I guess Severine and maybe her people sort of burned their boats, but some people stayed. And,
right, yes.
So there's sort of this constant fighting, or not constant fighting, but there's this constant tension, between the two. And maybe the newcomers don't really know that the tension is there even. Right. But it's there. And so that Severine's plan for all this really, it started to feel almost kind of like a sort of combination of the idea of, nativism and kind of environmentalism, and she talks about how the forest saved the people in a lot of ways because they needed the wood, they needed the creatures in it, they needed the food. And they ended up just, not worrying about the sustainability of it all. They cut the forest down, they took it all away. So, again, maybe I'm reading into it, but I'm just curious to what extent that was part of the message you wanted to get across in the book, was that Native people's environmentalism, taking care of the land, that sort of thing.
Right. It was not something that I was really consciously thinking about, but it is something that I do think about just in my daily life. I am, having grown up in Trinidad and Tobago, which was a British colony, it is hard not to have a worldview where you think about another group of people coming in and taking the resources of the place where you live. So it just kind of becomes part of your whole worldview. I was having a conversation with somebody recently who said, I said, the whole thing about colonialism in my book, somebody had pointed it out, and I hadn't really thought about it as that. I knew that it was there. I knew I had that element of people coming in and taking the resources and using it for themselves and not thinking about the people who were there before, but I did not think about it in the context of colonialism. And so this person that I was talking to said, how could you not? You come from a colony. That's you probably could not write a book that did not have some element of colonialism in it. And so I think it's just part of my worldview that I do think in this way. Even though, I am not one of the indigenous people from Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, my ancestry came from India and from Africa, or mostly India and Africa. And so, my worldview is a little bit different, but, I do think about that, people came and took resources, and especially in Trinidad where so many people came. I mean, we had literally every European nation come to Trinidad because we were so rich in resources, and and there was like so much fighting because this tiny island was really the landing spot before everybody tried to get to South America to find all the gold that they thought was going to be in South America. So everybody wanted a piece of this tiny, tiny island. So I don't think I could have gotten away from it if I tried. But I definitely wasn't really conscious of it at the time. But also just the idea of people using up resources and not replenishing it, or not thinking about what the consequences of that could be, is just something that I think about, especially, now, just in our lives right now. I mean, there's like giant holes appearing and in Russia, like in the ground, like just giant holes opening. I'm like, what is happening? What is going on? Just like crazy earthquakes, Hurricane Sandy. It just, the environment is like, you guys have screwed up.
Yeah.
So, we're going to push back now. It's just something that's in my head. And so it just came out on the page without me really giving a lot of thought to it.
I wonder the extent to which that's something that happens a lot in writing in general, where you're not thinking about stuff, but because it is part of you somewhere in your subconscious, it ends up coming out on the page somehow.
I think it does. I think it does. I feel like a lot of the things that people have brought to my attention when they've read the book, I've had to think about it. Like, it was not things that there were some things that I definitely consciously thought about. And there were a lot of things that I just did not even realize that were in there, that came up much later. And then I started having to think about it and sort of, consider whether or not it was something that I put in there on purpose. It was an accident. But I think in this particular case, it's just something that I think about all the time. Like, we talk about this at dinner when, the kids come home from school. These are things that we sort of talk about. So, like last year for Halloween, for example, my daughter went as colonialism because she said it was.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
She dressed up as a pilgrim, and she put a sign on herself that said colonialism. And I was like, okay. And
How
she said,
old is
she is now 14, so she
Okay.
was 13 at the time. And she said, well, it's the scariest thing I can think of.
Ooh, boy.
So, we kind of have deep conversations at home.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that, I think about and obviously talk about. So even that I wasn't sort of consciously putting it into the book, it obviously came in because it's just something that, we have that, in our consciousness all the time.
Sure. So I think really, and I mentioned the concept of the other earlier. That was air quotes for those that couldn't see. I think that a lot of this story is dealing with that realization that the other isn't so different from ourselves. That Severine has her own wants and needs, and as a person who cares, and maybe she's the evildoer in this story because she goes about things in sort of a way that is not, the best. Maybe
Right.
So you don't want to enslave people and kill people and whatnot. But, she has some of the same needs that everybody does, wanting family, wanting her home, all that. So in the end, maybe the idea here is that everybody isn't so different. And maybe
Right.
I was just curious if you could talk about that thought for a minute.
That definitely was conscious.
Yeah.
That was definitely a thing that I thought about as I was working on this. And, just being somebody who's, I guess, perceived as African-American walking through the United States, you cannot help but observe racism. You cannot help but observe, I'm a woman, sexism. It seems very strange to me, and it still is a little bit surprising to me when I see it, because I didn't grow up with it. Growing up in Trinidad and Tobago, the people who led the government looked like me and often came to my house because they were both my mother and father knew a lot of high-ranking people. The people who owned all the businesses looked like me. And there's like varying, racial types in Trinidad because of all of the people who came to Trinidad because we had so many European people come in. We had obviously slaves coming in from the west coast of Africa. We had a lot of people coming in from India as indentured laborers after slavery was abolished. There's a huge influx of people from Syria at some point. So the color gradations in Trinidad is really gorgeous because it goes from, very quite pale to extremely dark. But all of the people, they own all the stuff. They do all the things. So I didn't really have the kind of stark kind of racism that there is in the United States. I didn't grow up with it. I grew up with colorism, which is a little bit different, where if you're lighter brown, you have, you're seen more favorably than if you are darker brown. So there's colorism, but the sort of stark racism, I didn't really have to deal with there. So I was very conscious about thinking about that and putting that into the book, because I have often felt like the other. And so I wanted to say something about, that everybody's kind of the same. We all kind of have the same things going on. So that was definitely deliberate. And Severine, I think, because she's the bad guy in an island full of brown people, too, it kind of diffuses the racial aspect of it, because she's dark-skinned, Corinne is dark-skinned. So the idea of the other there is not, it's not like clearly, oh, well, Tracey's trying to have a conversation about race here. It's clearly not just about that. It's just about, I perceive you as different and you perceive me as different, and, we don't see eye to eye. And so we have this conflict because we perceive each other as different, and we have different maybe ways of going about things. Severine's way of going about things is obviously unacceptable to us as the readers and to Corinne as the girl who lives on the island, but it might be perfectly acceptable to Severine and the rest of the jumpies. Turning people might be like, all right, well, this is what we do. And, and just be like, that's how we do things. And we don't know that that's wrong. We just are, that's just how we, procreate. I don't know. I wasn't really thinking about that much, but, just having this idea of, we are separate and we don't understand each other was really important to get in there.
Yeah. Well, I think that was really powerful. And I always like to wrap up by asking, what are some key lessons people can take away and how can people apply those lessons? So I think that was a key lesson that we just talked about right there.
Yeah.
And what I'm curious about, though, is, any other key lessons you might want to mention, and then, how can people apply those lessons? What are you hoping people are able to do to change themselves for the better?
I wasn't thinking so much about people learning so much about the book, but one thing that I envisioned while I was writing it was that maybe kids would start asking some questions.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this is interesting. What if you are somebody who comes into somebody else's land? What does that mean for the people who are already there? And what does that mean for you who need land? I was kind of hoping to spark some conversations between children and either their parents or their teachers about, some of these ideas. Just even having the boats come in and nobody mentions the word slave, but it's clearly a slave ship that comes in. And just sort of touching on that and giving the reader the opportunity to say, what does this mean? Like, what do you mean people are chained up in the bottom of a boat? Like, what is that? To ask a question and sort of hopefully spark a conversation. And it's totally the teacher in me that puts in these little things where I don't spell it out, where it's just an opportunity, if somebody wants to take that opportunity, to ask that question. So those are the things I was really hoping to get to have these little sort of antenna go up and have a kid say, hey, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And those are like my favorite. When I get emails, sometimes back from parents, those are my favorite emails. My kid asked me about, what does this mean? I'm
Right.
like,
And I was able to actually start a conversation about it.
Right,
And
exactly.
I think a lot of people, so I'm not a parent, I can't speak for parents, but it seems to me that it might be a little difficult sometimes to start a conversation about slavery, for instance.
Right. Yes.
You don't just sit around the dinner table and say, okay,
No.
slavery tonight.
No.
So this is, again, a great way of starting that conversation. And I think anyone can learn from that, and that sometimes stories are a great way of bringing up uncomfortable truths that we can then talk about.
Right. And I think that fantasy is a really great way to do that rather than realistic fiction, because it's right in your face, whatever it is, the story is, it's in realistic fiction. Whereas in fantasy, there is so much more opportunity for subtlety. And then you have to start thinking about, how does this fantasy story apply into real life? Like, where does it fit in? This little thing here reminds me of this thing in my real life. How does that match up? And then you start having a conversation. So I actually really love fantasy for that, because I think you can get to a lot more in a work of fantasy than you can in realistic fiction. So I'm writing a lot more fantasy now than I am writing anything else.
You're walking the walk.
I'm walking the walk.
Good for you. So I asked you about picking another book that I thought might be a good counterpart for yours.
Yes.
So tell me about the book you picked.
So I picked Anne Ursu's Breadcrumbs. Okay. And I chose it not because it's definitely not an atmospheric sort of horror story, which, a lot of people describe the Jumbies as. By the way, I did not think I was writing horror at all when I wrote it. I was just
I don't know if I would consider it a horror story either. That's interesting that people say that.
People have been calling it horror, and I was as surprised as anybody else, because I thought it was just a fairy tale and an adventure.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, it's maybe a little scarier of a fairy tale, but
right.
if you actually look at some of the original fairy tales, they were pretty scary.
Bluebeard is like the worst, right? With the dead wives in the closet. So it's not quite that. But anyway, so I chose Breadcrumbs because it has that same kind of fairy tale base. There is the Snow Queen. And then there is this adventure in the woods.
So quickly summarize Breadcrumbs.
So Breadcrumbs is about this girl. Now I can't remember her name. I read it such a long time ago. But anyway, the main character has, she and her best buddy, they're having a fight, and he goes off into the forest, and apparently he gets taken over by the Snow Queen. She sort of takes over his mind and soul, and so he's sort of stuck in the forest, and then she has to go into the forest and save him. She has to go in and rescue him and get him back out. And of course, in the forest, there are all kinds of crazy things going on. There's, all kinds of crazy, creepy creatures. You don't know who you can trust. And, there are a lot of dangerous things. And it's winter, and she's frozen, and, all of that. And so she goes and she finds her friend and, finds a way to get him back out. So I really felt that they were similar, whereas mine, of course, is very tropical. This is wintry, but they're both, getting into the forest.
I prefer the weather in your story.
Yes, I know. Personally. So do I. So both the main characters have to go into the forest, and they have to basically battle a very powerful creature to save someone at the end. So I thought that Anne's book was really a nice counterpart in that way. Yeah. Because they both have they both have a very strong fairy tale feel.
So what is the base for that one? So that's taking place in a cold climate. Is that?
Yes. And it's also modern, whereas
modern, okay.
I think of the Jumbies as, I don't really give it sort of a time frame, but I kind of think of it as my great-grandmother's time. Like Corinne could have been my great-grandmother.
Yeah, I mean, people aren't really out with cell phones and stuff like
that
in the story.
Right, and there are no cars. There's really no modern technology in it. There are ships, but,
Ships have been around for a long time.
But ships have been around for an extremely long time, exactly. So, So I don't think of this as contemporary at all, whereas Anne's book is contemporary. It takes place in the United States, in Northeast, and I think it's in Maine. And the girl, she's in school, and, this whole thing happens over the course of a weekend. They come home from school, and the boy hasn't been to school because, of course, he's been taken by the Snow Queen. And so she spends her weekend basically trying to rescue her best friend. And then, of course, everything is resolved by the time they have to go to school on Monday.
How convenient.
How convenient.
They still go to school in the
They
end.
still go to school on Monday.
I'm sure all the parents, all the parents were like, they better make it back for school. We're not giving our kids any ideas. Well, that sounds really interesting. I'll have to go check that book out, since now that I've read the Jumbies, I would be curious to know, how it's different.
Oh, it's really great. I really love it.
Yeah.
It really is quite different. It really is just the, that sort of supernatural fairy tale element, and the girls who are taking the lead in both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really feel that these two girls would be very good friends if they had the opportunity to meet in another book.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Well, maybe that could happen.
I know.
Can be the fan fiction.
It could be the fan fiction. That actually might be a lot of fun. Yeah.
So I want to move on to our thunder round, and I'm going to ask you some quick, fun questions.
All right.
And then we'll wrap things up. Sound good?
Yes.
All right. First off, I love traveling. I love going places. I love all of this. Exploring is wonderful. And so I'm always curious to find out what people's favorite places are. And, it can be around the corner. It can be a store, it can be whatever, just or somewhere the moon, whatever you feel like is just some of your favorite spots you've stood in and been like, wow.
Well, Maracas Beach in Trinidad is my all-time favorite place to be. So anytime I go home, I always make sure that I make it to Maracas Beach. But internationally, I had just the greatest time being in Paris when I was a teenager, an older teenager. I was, I think, 19. I was by myself in Paris.
Trouble.
Oh my gosh, it was so great. And so that is one of my favorite times of my life, is just sort of running around Paris by myself when I was 19 years old.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Wow. I definitely did not make it out of the country until after that time in my life.
Yeah.
So that would have been interesting. Yeah, I didn't study abroad or anything. And
right, and it was because I did. I studied abroad, and so I happened to be in Paris by myself for about 2-3 weeks by myself. It was good times.
Yeah, I bet.
Bad decisions,
Is that what those? Yes. We're connecting that? Nice loop back. What is something on your bucket list that you haven't gotten to? Or maybe do you have a bucket list? Do you believe in that sort of thing?
I do. I want to do more travel. Since we've had the kids, we haven't been traveling that much. We really kind of go back and forth to Trinidad because, of course, we have babysitting there. Free babysitting.
Free.
And free food. So we go back and forth a lot, and we haven't traveled to other places. And one of the places I really am desperate to go is Spain. I have a friend who recently moved to Spain, so I think I will be going there very soon.
Yeah,
She'll be getting a visit very soon, especially now that the kids are a little bit older. But I just want to travel more. There's just so many things to see, and I have not seen hardly any. And, the Travel Channel on TV is just not cutting it for me.
Yeah, I know. Fair enough. I 100% agree. So more travel.
Yes.
Good. Always good. Can you recommend a book besides any of the ones that have been brought up today for people to read? Maybe even totally outside of your genre. Just a book that you think is great, people might not know about.
That is, I actually recently read a book by Ya Gyasi called Homegoing.
Homegoing.
Yes. And so it's an adult novel, and it is about a family who one of the children, this woman had 2 daughters, and they were separated. And one of the daughters grew up in Ghana, and one of the daughters was taken on a slave ship to the United States. And it follows the family, the descendants of this one woman, all of the things that happened to the descendants in Ghana, and all of the things that happened to the descendants in the United States. It is amazing. It is difficult to get through. I will not pretend. There were a lot of parts of it that were really hard to read, but it is beautiful. And it's, it really, the way that it ends, the way that things resolve at the end is just gorgeous. So I would very highly recommend this book. I enjoyed it a lot. I read it extremely quickly. I think I read it in 2 days because I felt it was one of those books where I almost felt like if I stopped, I don't know if I would pick it up because there were parts that were just painful to read.
Yeah.
Just especially the part about the Middle Passage and the family that became slaves and all of the things that happened to them. It was really difficult to get through, and even like after slavery and all of that, just economic disparity and all of that. She really dug in, and she's a young writer. I think it's her first novel, actually.
Great. So let's wrap it all up.
Okay.
So importantly, where can people buy the book? Where can people buy the Jumbies?
In any bookstore, also on Amazon.com or BN.com, but it is still widely available. You can now get paperback copies as well. And so, anywhere, local bookstore.
Great.
I can order it for you.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
What else is happening? What are you working on now? Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I'm working on the sequel.
Oh.
So they liked it so much that they ordered a sequel.
That's exciting. Always good to hear.
Yeah. So a lot of the things that we talked about, I touched a tiny bit on the aspect of slavery and people coming over on boats. And I was able to dive into that much more in the second novel. I think it is much less frightening. The second version is much more adventure in the second one than scary stuff, because we already know all the scary people.
Right.
But there are new Jumbies because I didn't introduce all of the Jumbies from Trinidad and Tobago folklore in this first one because there's so many. So I introduced a couple more Jumbies, two that I actually quite love. One of them is named Mama Jlo. Mama Jlo. And so she is sort of the queen of the mermaids. She's sort of the leader of all the mermaids. Ooh. And the other one's name is Papa Bois, and he is he is the protector of all the forest and the forest animals, and so they're
high-ranking Jumbies.
Yes,
really.
Yeah. So they come in the second one, and they're much more powerful than any of the Jumbies that we have previously met. And they have, they are very, what's the word I'm trying to think of? They're very resolute in their thoughts and in what they want and how they want things to happen. And so they make a lot more trouble for Corinne and her pals the second time around. Ooh. Yes.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah. It's fun too. It was a lot of fun to write this one.
Great.
Yeah.
So do you have any sense of when people can start looking for that?
It's supposed to come out in fall 2017.
Okay.
Assuming that I get all of my revisions done.
Right. Assuming everything goes well.
Yes.
Next year in time for the holidays.
That's right. So next year I would say probably in time for Halloween.
Oh.
I think that's probably what they're going for.
Sure.
Is to have it out in time for Halloween. So hopefully, fingers crossed.
Sounds good.
That is when that will be out.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tracey, for being here. I really appreciate it. This was a wonderful conversation. And I think the book is so great and so fun. Even if you don't have kids, it is just a really fun read. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.